Have you ever walked into a room knowing your life would never be the same? That moment when you cross a line so bold, so irreversible, that there's no going back? I'm asking because I'm curious where you're from. Does your state have those moments that define everything that comes after? Because 3 years ago, I thought I'd left mine behind in Chicago. I was wrong. The Cathedral of St. Augustine was magnificent in the way that only old money and older sins could create. Marble columns stretched toward vaulted ceilings painted with cherubs who seemed to mock the proceedings below. Hundreds of guests filled mahogany pews, their whispered conversations echoing off stone walls that had witnessed more confessions than prayers. Everyone who mattered in Chicago was here. Politicians, judges, business leaders. And me, dressed in black catering uniform, carrying a silver tray I had no business holding. Elena Castellanos had died 3 years ago. At least, that's what everyone believed. What they didn't know was that she'd been reborn as Elena Santos, single mother, freelance journalist, and today, wedding crasher with a very specific agenda. My hands trembled as I moved through the crowd, refilling champagne glasses for guests who didn't see me. Invisible was exactly what I needed to be. For now, the irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 2 years trying to disappear, only to return for the most public spectacle possible. Luca Torino stood at the altar in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. Even from the back of the cathedral, he commanded attention. At 32, he possessed the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. Broad shoulders, olive skin, dark hair styled with the precision that came from having people whose job it was to make sure he looked perfect. He was beautiful. He was powerful. He was a killer. And once upon a time, I'd loved him with every broken piece of my soul. The bride, Sofia Benedetti, was a vision in ivory silk and family expectations. 24 years old, daughter of Judge Marcus Benedetti, she represented everything Luca needed to legitimize his empire. Clean bloodlines, political connections, and enough naive sweetness to make the media believe the notorious Torino heir had finally settled down. What a joke! Father Morrison's voice carried across the cathedral as he began the ceremony. The same man who'd baptized half the crime families in Chicago was about to unite 2 of the most powerful in holy matrimony. God had a twisted sense of humor. I positioned myself near the side aisle, heart hammering against my ribs. 3 years. 3 years since I'd seen his face, heard his voice, felt the gravitational pull of his presence. 3 years since I'd discovered the truth about who he really was and what he was capable of. 3 years since I'd fled Chicago with his child growing inside me and the evidence that could destroy everything he'd built. My son, Marco, 2 years old with his father's dark hair and my stubborn chin. Currently safe with Mrs. Rodriguez 3 blocks away, completely unaware that his mother was about to declare war on the most dangerous man in Chicago. The moment came sooner than I expected. Father Morrison asked if anyone had reason why these 2 should not be wed. The traditional pause that no one ever filled. The ceremonial opportunity for objection that existed purely for dramatic effect. Except today, someone would fill it. Today, someone would speak. I stepped into the center aisle, my voice cutting through the sacred silence like a blade. I'm sorry, but I object. The cathedral erupted. Gasps echoed off the stone walls as hundreds of heads turned toward me. Security moved immediately, but I was already speaking, my voice trained by years of journalism to project over chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing the wedding of Luca Torino, heir to the Torino crime family. The same Luca Torino who ordered the execution of Anthony Martinez 2 months ago. The same man whose money laundering operation has corrupted half the judges in this room. The same man whose drug distribution network has poisoned our neighborhoods for the past decade. Sofia's face went white beneath her veil. Judge Benedetti was on his feet, shouting for security. But it was Luca's reaction that stopped my breath. He turned slowly, those green-gray eyes I'd memorized finding mine across the distance. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His face went through a series of emotions in seconds. Shock, disbelief, rage, and something that might have been relief. Elena, he said, and my name on his lips was both prayer and curse. I have evidence, I continued, pulling out the USB drive that contained everything Tony Martinez had died to give me. Financial records, recorded conversations, Photographic proof of crimes that could bring down not just Luca, but half the powerful men in this room. Tony died because he tried to expose the truth. I won't let his death be meaningless. Security was moving faster now, but chaos was my ally. Wedding guests were either fleeing or pulling out phones to record. The bride was crying, her perfect day dissolving into the kind of scandal that would dominate headlines for weeks. Luca moved then, stepping off the altar with the fluid grace of a predator. No panic, no desperate commands to his men. Just calm, controlled fury and something else. Something that looked almost like admiration. We stared at each other across the cathedral aisle, 3 years of separation collapsing into this single moment. He was older, harder around the edges, but still devastatingly handsome. Still dangerous in ways that made my body remember things my mind had tried to forget. You always did know how to make an entrance, cara mia, he said, and his voice carried the same rough velvet that used to whisper my name in the dark. His men reached me then, but I was already moving. I'd planned my exit as carefully as my entrance. The side door led to a maintenance corridor that connected to the parking structure. I ran, heels clicking against stone, heart pounding with adrenaline and the intoxicating rush of finally fighting back. Behind me, I heard Luca's voice cutting through the chaos, calm and commanding. Let her go. I'll handle this personally. Those words should have terrified me. Instead, they sent heat spiraling through my chest that I had no right to feel. Even now, even after everything, part of me responded to his voice like a tuning fork struck at the perfect frequency. I made it to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that wouldn't attract attention, and drove through Chicago streets that blurred past my windows. My hands shook on the steering wheel as the magnitude of what I'd just done hit me. I'd declared war on Luca Torino in front of half of Chicago's power structure. There was no going back now. No more hiding. No more pretending Elena Santos was just another single mother trying to make it day by day. The war between us had officially begun. My apartment in Lincoln Park was modest, 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. Mrs. Rodriguez met me at the door, her weathered face creased with worry. Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Mrs. Rodriguez. Thank you for watching, Marco. How is he? Like an angel, as always. He's sleeping now. But Elena, there were men here earlier. Well-dressed men asking questions about you. I told them nothing, but they made me nervous. My blood went cold. Already. He'd found me already. What kind of questions? About your schedule, your work, your family. They were very polite, but their eyes. Cold eyes, Mija. Be careful. I'll be careful. Thank you for the warning. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, I checked the locks twice, then moved to Marco's bedroom. My son slept peacefully in his toddler bed, dark lashes resting against cheeks that would break hearts someday. He had Luca's strong jaw, my full lips, and a smile that could light up entire rooms. He was perfect. He was innocent. And he was about to become the center of a storm he didn't understand. I touched his soft hair gently, guilt crushing my chest. I tried to give him a normal life, tried to keep him safe from the violence that had defined my relationship with his father. But normalcy was a luxury I could no longer afford. Tony Martinez had died because he'd tried to expose Luca's crimes. His murder had gone unpunished while corrupt officials buried the evidence, and the media moved on to easier stories. But I had the real evidence. Everything Tony had gathered before Luca's men silenced him permanently. Financial records proving money laundering through legitimate businesses. Recorded conversations discussing drug distribution territories. Photographic evidence of meetings between Luca and corrupt officials. Enough to bring down an empire. The question was whether I'd live long enough to use it. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, which in my current situation meant only one thing. I answered without speaking. Elena. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I could hear the underlying tension. We need to talk. We just talked, Luca. In front of 300 witnesses and God himself. That wasn't talking. That was you making accusations you can't prove. I can prove everything, and you know it. Tony died because he was going to expose you. How many others have you killed to keep your secrets? Silence stretched between us, loaded with 3 years of unspoken words and unresolved pain. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Elena. You never did. Come home. We'll discuss this privately. Home. as if his penthouse had ever been anything more than a beautiful cage, as if I could ever go back to being the naive woman who'd fallen in love with a lie. I'm not coming anywhere near you, Luca. I meant what I said today. The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not. You have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, I handle this my way. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my reflection ghostly in its dark screen. 24 hours. Barely enough time to disappear again. To take Marco and run to some city where Luca's reach couldn't find us. But running would mean Tony's death remained meaningless. Running would mean Luca continued destroying lives with impunity. I'd spent 3 years running. I was done. Outside my window, Chicago glittered in the gathering dusk, beautiful and dangerous as the man I'd once loved. Somewhere out there, Luca was planning his next move. His wedding was ruined, his reputation damaged, but he was far from defeated. Men like Luca Torino didn't stay down. They retaliated. I moved through my apartment, checking windows and planning escape routes I hoped I wouldn't need. Everything felt different now, charged with the electricity that comes before storms. The careful life I'd built for Marco and myself was about to be torn apart, but it had been built on borrowed time anyway. Luca would come for me. Not tonight, probably not tomorrow, but soon. When he did, I'd be ready. I had Tony's evidence. I had the truth, and I had 3 years of anger to fuel my resolve. What I didn't have was a choice. The moment I'd stood up in that cathedral, I'd chosen this path. War with the man I'd loved. War with the father of my child. War with the most dangerous criminal in Chicago. Marco stirred in his sleep, making the soft sounds that meant he was dreaming. I wondered what he dreamed about. Playgrounds and picture books, probably. Simple joys that had nothing to do with the violence that had shaped his parents' lives. I'd protect those dreams as long as I could. But eventually, he'd need to know the truth about who his father was. About who I'd been. About the choices that had brought us to this moment. Eventually, he'd understand why his mother had crashed a wedding and declared war on a king. Tonight, though, he could sleep peacefully while his mother planned for battle. The knock came at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not the polite tap of a neighbor or the urgent hammering of an emergency. 3 measured strikes against my apartment door that spoke of patience, control, and absolute certainty that I would answer. I'd been expecting him, of course. Luca Torino wasn't the type of man to make idle threats or wait for convenient timing. When he said 24 hours, he meant he'd give me exactly long enough to realize the futility of running before he came to collect what belonged to him. And apparently, in his mind, I still belonged to him. I checked Marco's room one more time. My son slept soundly, exhausted from a day at the park where he'd chased pigeons and laughed at nothing the way only children could. His bedroom was in the back of the apartment, furthest from the front door. If I was careful, if I was quiet, Luca would never know he existed. Another 3 knocks, patient but insistent. I opened the door. 3 years dissolved like smoke. Luca stood in my hallway wearing a black wool coat over dark jeans and a gray sweater, his formal wedding attire replaced by something that made him look devastatingly human. His green-gray eyes found mine immediately, and I felt that familiar jolt of electricity that had always existed between us. Time had been kind to him, adding a few lines around those impossible eyes and a hardness to his jaw that spoke of difficult decisions and harder consequences. "Hello, Elena." His voice was quiet, respectful of the late hour and thin apartment walls. Always considerate, even when he was being terrifying. It was one of the things that had made him so dangerous to my heart. "You found me faster than I expected. I never stopped looking. May I come in?" The polite request was vintage Luca. He could have forced his way inside, could have sent men to break down my door and drag me to wherever he wanted this conversation to happen. Instead, he stood in my hallway like a civilized man asking for permission to enter my home. It was manipulative as hell, and it worked exactly like he knew it would. I stepped back, allowing him into my small living space. He moved with the same fluid grace I remembered, taking in details with the thoroughness of someone who'd survived by noticing everything. The modest furniture, the stack of journalism textbooks on my coffee table, the framed photo of Marco on the bookshelf that I prayed he wouldn't notice. "Nice place," he said, and I couldn't tell if he was being sincere or mocking. "You always preferred simple things. It's honest. Clean. The opposite of everything you represent." He turned to face me, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. Still fighting the same war, I see. Still convinced you know who I am and what I represent. I know exactly who you are, Luca. I spent 8 months learning every detail of your operation while lying in your bed and pretending to love you. The words hit him like physical blows. Something flickered in his eyes, pain maybe, or anger. With Luca, the two emotions were often indistinguishable. Pretending, he repeated, voice soft and dangerous. Is that what you call it? What would you call it? Research? An extended interview? I was working on the biggest story of my career, and you were the subject. Everything else was just cover. Lies came easier when they served as armor. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and far too dangerous to admit. The truth was that I'd gone undercover to expose him and ended up falling so completely in love that it had nearly destroyed me to walk away. 8 months, Elena. 8 months of waking up next to me, of letting me hold you when you had nightmares, of planning a future that you knew was built on deception. If that was just cover, you deserve an award for acting. He moved closer, and I forced myself not to step back. Standing my ground with Luca had always been about projecting strength even when my knees were shaking. I was good at my job. That's all. Your job, he said, and his voice carried that edge I remembered from when business associates disappointed him. Tell me about your job, Elena. Tell me about the story you were so desperate to write that you crawled into bed with a monster. The memory hit me without warning, as vivid as if I'd lived it yesterday instead of 3 years ago. I'd been Elena Castellanos then, investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, following a lead about corruption in the prosecutor's office. What I'd found instead was a web of connection that led straight to the Torino family and their sophisticated money laundering operation. Luca had been supposed to be a source, maybe a brief encounter that would give me insight into how organized crime interfaced with legitimate business. I'd approached him at a charity gala, playing the role of a socialite with more money than sense. He'd seen through the performance immediately. You're not who you're pretending to be, he'd said, cornering me near the silent auction display. The question is whether you're a cop, a journalist, or just someone with very bad judgment. I should have walked away then. Should have abandoned the story and found a different angle, a safer approach. Instead, I doubled down on the lie. Let him buy me dinner. Let conversation flow into drinks and drinks flow into the most intellectually stimulating night I'd ever spent with another human being. He'd been nothing like I'd expected. Yes, he was dangerous, powerful, clearly comfortable with violence when necessary. But he was also brilliant, surprisingly well-read, and possessed a dry sense of humor that had me laughing despite every professional instinct screaming warnings. One dinner became two. Two became a pattern. The pattern became something deeper, more complicated, more real than anything I'd ever experienced. 8 months later, I was living in his penthouse, sharing his bed, and drowning in feelings I couldn't separate from the investigation that had brought us together. I wrote the story, I said finally, pulling myself back to the present. I had everything I needed to expose your operation, your connections, your methods. I was ready to publish. But you didn't, he pointed out. The Chicago Tribune never ran Elena Castellanos' expose of the Torino crime family. Instead, Elena Castellanos disappeared completely, leaving behind an apartment full of research and a man who thought he understood what love meant. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakably real. It made my chest ache in ways I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I couldn't publish because I discovered something that changed everything. I found out about Tony Martinez. His expression shifted, became more guarded. Tony Martinez was a government informant working for the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. He'd been feeding information about various crime families to federal agents for 2 years when I met him. Tony was also my source, my inside contact who'd helped me understand the complexities of how families like yours operated. And you believe I had him killed. I don't believe it, Luca. I know it. I have the recording. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Luca's face revealed nothing, but I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was trying to determine how much I actually knew, how much I could prove. What recording? Tony was smart enough to know that informing was dangerous business. He recorded every conversation, every meeting, every phone call that had anything to do with his work, including the call where your voice gave explicit orders for his elimination. Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Show me. I don't have it here. I'm not stupid enough to keep evidence like that in my apartment where your people could find it. My people, as you call them, could find anything they wanted to find. Elena, the fact that you're still breathing means I don't want you found yet. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone he'd used to discuss dinner plans, which somehow made it more chilling than if he'd shouted. Is that supposed to reassure me? It's supposed to remind you that games have consequences. You crashed my wedding, humiliated my bride's family, and made accusations that could destabilize everything I've built. The only reason you're not already dead is because I want to understand why. Because Tony was my friend, I said, and the words came out harder than I'd intended. Because he had a daughter in college and a wife who loved him, and you had him murdered for doing his job. Because someone needs to speak for the dead when the living are too afraid. Your friend, he repeated, and something dangerous flickered in his expression. Tell me about this friendship, Elena. Tell me about how close you were to Tony Martinez. Jealousy. Even now, even after everything, he was jealous. The realization should have been satisfying, proof that I'd hurt him the way he'd hurt me. Instead, it just made everything more complicated. He was my source. That's all. That's all. Luca echoed, taking another step closer. The way you say that suggests there might have been more to consider. There wasn't anything between Tony and me beyond professional respect. But even if there had been, what business would it be of yours? You were engaged to Sofia Benedetti. You moved on pretty quickly for someone who claims to have spent 3 years searching for his lost love. The engagement was business, nothing more. The Benedettis needed political protection, my family needed judicial cooperation. Sofia understood the arrangement as well as I did. How romantic. I'm sure she felt very special walking down the aisle to marry a man who was using her for political connections. Don't lecture me about romance, Elena. You're the one who disappeared without explanation, leaving nothing behind but questions and a hole where my future used to be. His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I'd left without saying goodbye, without offering any explanation beyond the note I'd scribbled in shaking handwriting. I'd been a coward, choosing flight over fight because I'd known that facing him meant risking everything I'd convinced myself I believed about right and wrong. I left because I found out who you really were, what you really did. How many people suffered so you could live in luxury and comfort? And what about what you did? What about 8 months of lies, of sharing my bed while planning my destruction? What about making me believe that someone could actually love me for who I was instead of what I could provide them? The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. Luca Torino, heir to one of Chicago's most powerful crime families, admitting to loneliness and the hope for genuine connection. It was the kind of honesty that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. I did love you, I whispered before I could stop myself. That was never pretense. Past tense, he noted, but his voice had lost its edge. You made it past tense when you killed Tony. When you proved that your business was more important than human life. I didn't kill Tony Martinez. The words hung in the air between us, simple and direct, and completely impossible to believe. I have the recording, Luca. Your voice giving the order. You have a recording of someone's voice giving an order. That doesn't mean it was my voice or my order. I stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception. Luca had always been difficult to read when he wanted to be, but I'd learned to recognize certain tells during our time together. The slight tightening around his eyes when he was calculating. The way his left hand moved toward his jacket when he was preparing for trouble. The subtle shift in his posture when he was about to reveal something important. Right now, he looked completely sincere. You're saying someone impersonated you? Someone ordered Tony's death using your name? I'm saying that if Tony Martinez was killed on orders from someone claiming to be me, then we have a bigger problem than your desire for justice. Because whoever did it wanted you to believe I was responsible. The implications of what he was suggesting hit me like cold water. If Luca hadn't ordered Tony's death, if someone had deliberately framed him for the murder, then everything I believed for 3 years was wrong. Worse, it meant Tony's real killer was still out there, unpunished, and possibly planning additional moves. Why should I believe you? Because you knew me better than anyone, Elena. 8 months in my bed, 8 months of conversations about everything from philosophy to family, 8 months of seeing me at my most vulnerable. Do you really believe I would have had your friend killed? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to maintain the anger that had sustained me through 3 years of hiding, 3 years of raising our son alone, 3 years of believing that the man I'd loved was a monster who'd destroyed an innocent life. But doubt was creeping in like water through cracks in a foundation. Someone wanted me to believe it was you, I said slowly. Someone wanted me to run, to disappear, to keep me away from the investigation. Or someone wanted to use your investigation to damage my reputation. Killing Tony and making it look like my order accomplished both goals. A sound from Marco's room made us both freeze. Just the soft rustle of blankets and a sleepy murmur, but it was enough to remind me that we weren't alone in this apartment. That the conversation we were having could wake the most important person in my world. Luca's head tilted slightly, the predatory awareness that never fully left him engaged by the unexpected noise. You have a roommate? My heart hammered against my ribs. Something like a roommate. Yes. I need to see the recording, Elena. And you need to hear what I have to tell you about the night Tony Martinez died. Tomorrow, I said quickly, desperate to get him out of the apartment before Marco woke up completely. We can meet tomorrow and discuss everything. Tonight. This can't wait. Luca, please. It's late, and I need time to process what you've told me. If you're telling the truth about Tony, then everything I've believed is wrong. I need to think. He studied my face for a long moment, those green-gray eyes missing nothing. I had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through every lie I'd ever told myself about getting over him. One more day, Elena. Then we settle this completely. All of it. The recording, the accusations, the 3 years of silence between us. Everything. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He moved toward the door, then stopped, his hand on the knob. Elena, he said without turning around. I never stopped loving you. The engagement, the wedding, all of it was just marking time until I could find you and bring you home. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with racing thoughts and the devastating realization that my carefully constructed hatred might be built on lies. In his room, Marco stirred again, and I went to check on him. My son slept peacefully, one small hand curled against his cheek, completely unaware that his father had been standing 10 feet away. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to trust the man who'd broken my heart or continue believing that he was the monster who destroyed my friend. Tomorrow, I would have to choose between justice and love, between the past and an impossible future. Tonight, though, I sat in my son's doorway and tried to remember how to breathe while my world shifted on its axis once again. I should have known better than to trust Luca's promise of one more day. I should have grabbed Marco and run the moment his footsteps faded down the hallway. Instead, I'd spent the night staring at my ceiling, replaying every word of our conversation and trying to reconcile the man I'd loved with the monster I'd believed him to be. By morning, it was too late for running. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at 7 a.m. as usual, ready to watch Marco while I attended a freelance assignment interview downtown. It was supposed to be routine, normal, the kind of ordinary Tuesday morning that had defined our life for the past 2 years. Instead, it became the moment when all my careful deceptions finally collapsed. Marco was having one of his chatty mornings, babbling about the pigeons in the park and asking endless questions about why the sky was blue and whether clouds had feelings. At 2 years old, he possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that made every conversation an adventure. He also had his father's stubborn streak and piercing intelligence, though he was still too young to understand what either trait might mean for his future. We made it exactly 3 blocks before the black SUVs appeared. 2 of them, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of professional drivers and careful planning. They boxed in my Honda at the intersection of Lincoln and Fullerton, and I realized with crystalline clarity that Luca had never intended to wait for our meeting. He'd been watching, planning, positioning his people while I'd fooled myself into believing I had choices. The passenger door of the first SUV opened, and Vincent Marcelli stepped out. Luca's second-in-command was a mountain of a man with kind eyes and the soft voice of someone who'd learned that true power didn't need to announce itself. He'd always been respectful to me during the months I'd lived in Luca's world, treating me with the careful courtesy reserved for someone the boss cared about. "Good morning, Miss Santos," he said, approaching my driver's side window with empty hands visible. "Mr. Torino would like to speak with you." "I'm on my way to a job interview, Vincent. This isn't a good time. I'm afraid Mr. Torino feels this can't wait. He's asked me to escort you and your son to somewhere more private for conversation." My blood turned to ice. "Your son?" He'd said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment I wondered if I'd misheard. But Vincent's expression was gentle and knowing, and I realized that Luca had already put the pieces together. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. "Ma'am, with respect, the child in your back seat has his father's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Mr. Torino would very much like to meet his son properly." In the rearview mirror, I could see Marco strapped into his car seat, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. He was singing softly to himself, some nonsense song about trains and cookies that he'd invented yesterday. His dark hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window, and his green-gray eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that belonged to children who'd never known fear. He looked exactly like his father. "Please don't make this difficult," Vincent continued. "You know Mr. Torino well enough to understand that he won't be deterred from this conversation. It's better for everyone if we handle this quietly." The implied threat was gentle but unmistakable. I could cooperate, or Luca's men would make the choice for me. Either way, this confrontation was happening. "Where?" I asked, already knowing I'd lost this battle before it began. "Millennium Park. The bean sculpture. Public, safe, lots of witnesses. Mr. Torino wants to talk, not cause problems." 20 minutes later, I stood near Cloud Gate holding Marco's hand while Luca approached across the plaza. He moved with that same controlled grace I remembered, but there was something different in his posture. Tension, maybe. Anticipation. The careful movements of a man approaching something precious and fragile. Marco noticed him immediately. My son had always been drawn to tall men, probably because Mrs. Rodriguez's elderly husband was the closest thing to a father figure in his young life. When he saw Luca walking toward us, his face lit up with the innocent friendliness that made strangers smile in grocery stores. "Mama, look, big man." The words hit Luca like physical blows. He stopped walking, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Wonder, disbelief, something that might have been grief for all the time he'd already lost. When he started moving again, it was slower, more careful, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Hello, Marco," he said when he reached us, crouching down to the toddler's eye level. "I'm a friend of your mama's." Marco studied him with the serious consideration that children applied to new people. Then, without warning or explanation, he pointed at Luca's face and declared with absolute certainty, "Papa?" The word hung in the air between us like a detonation. Luca's face went white, then flushed with color as the reality hit him completely. This wasn't just Elena's son. This was his son, his child, his blood. "Marco, no," I said quickly, but the damage was done. "He looks like Papa," Marco insisted, unaware that he was destroying two adults with his innocent observation. "Mama, why Papa here?" Luca's eyes found mine, and I saw a universe of questions and accusations and desperate hope in that single look. "How long have you known? Why didn't you tell me? How could you keep this from me?" I tried to find words, tried to construct some explanation that might make this betrayal seem less absolute. But what explanation existed for hiding a man's child from him for 2 years? What justification could possibly suffice? "We need to talk," Lucas said, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. "Now. I can't. I have responsibilities, obligations. Marco needs his routine, his lunch, his nap. This isn't how I wanted him to learn about any of this." "How you wanted him to learn?" Luca's voice carried an edge that made several nearby tourists glance in our direction. "Elena, he's 2 years old. He's my son, and he's been alive for 2 years, and you never thought to mention this rather significant detail?" Marco, sensing tension he couldn't understand, moved closer to my leg and looked up at both adults with worried eyes. The last thing I wanted was for this confrontation to frighten him. "Mama sad?" he asked, his small hand patting my knee in the comforting gesture he'd learned from watching too many episodes of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. "No, baby. Mama's just talking to her friend." But the lie felt hollow even to me. Nothing about this situation was friendly, and Marco was perceptive enough to recognize the undercurrents of emotion even if he couldn't interpret them. Luca's expression softened as he watched our son try to comfort me. There was something devastating about seeing this dangerous, powerful man reduced to wonder by a toddler's innocent concern. "He's beautiful," Lucas said quietly. "He's perfect, and he's mine, and you've stolen 2 years of his life from me. I was protecting him. From what? From having a father who could provide for him, protect him, give him every advantage in the world? From having a father who kills people for a living? I shot back, then immediately regretted it as Marco's eyes went wide. But Luca didn't explode the way I'd expected. Instead, he seemed to fold in on himself slightly, the weight of truth and implication settling on his shoulders. You're right, he said finally. You're absolutely right to want to protect him from that. But Elena, whether you like it or not, he's already connected to that world through me. The only question is whether he has a father who can protect him or whether he faces those dangers alone. Marco had lost interest in our adult conversation and was now chasing pigeons near the fountain. His laughter carried across the plaza, bright and joyful and completely at odds with the gravity of our situation. I need time to process this, I said. I need time to figure out how to explain to a 2-year-old why his father has been absent from his life. Time is a luxury we don't have, Luca replied, but his voice had gentled. Elena, crashing my wedding yesterday didn't just embarrass me. It sent ripples through every family in Chicago. People are asking questions, choosing sides, repositioning themselves for what might come next. What are you saying? I'm saying that your dramatic revelation has consequences you didn't consider. There are people who would use my son against me, people who would hurt him to hurt me. As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mrs. Rodriguez. I answered quickly, expecting a question about groceries or scheduling. Elena, Mija, you need to come home now. Her voice was tight with fear. There are men at your building. Different men from yesterday. These ones aren't polite. My stomach dropped. Where are you? I took my grandson to the store when I saw them arrive. But Elena, they're not just asking questions anymore. They broke into Mrs. Patterson's apartment by mistake, looking for you. When they realized their error, they didn't apologize. I met Luca's eyes and saw my own fear reflected back at me. He'd been listening to the conversation, close enough to hear Mrs. Rodriguez's panicked voice. Who knows about Marco? He asked immediately. Mrs. Rodriguez. Her husband. A few neighbors who've seen him playing in the hallway. His pediatrician. The daycare where he goes sometimes. His last name? Santos. He's listed as Marcos Santos. That might buy us time, but not much. If they're breaking into apartments, they're serious about finding you. Who are they? Who would want to hurt Marco? The same people who killed Tony Martinez and made sure you blame me for it. The same people who've spent 3 years positioning themselves to move against my family while we were distracted by internal conflicts. The Castellanos, I realized with growing horror. It had been staring me in the face the entire time, hidden behind the name I'd chosen when I'd reinvented myself. Elena Castellanos had become Elena Santos, but the connection was still there for anyone smart enough to look. Luca nodded grimly. Your investigation into Tony's death was getting too close to the truth. Someone needed you gone, needed your attention focused elsewhere. What better way than to make you believe I was responsible for killing your friend? But why reveal themselves now? Why come after me directly? Because yesterday you proved you're not content to stay hidden. You have evidence that could expose whoever really killed Tony, and now they know you're willing to use it. Marco returned from his pigeon chase, his small face flushed with excitement and his hands dirty from the playground. He looked between Luca and me with the expectant expression children wore when they sensed adult attention might be focused on them. Mama, I'm hungry, he announced with the dramatic flair of someone who believed starvation was imminent. We'll get lunch soon, baby, I promised, but my mind was racing through options. Going back to the apartment was obviously out of the question. Hotels required identification that could be traced. Mrs. Rodriguez's place would be compromised within hours. Friends and family were non-existent in Chicago. I'd been careful to keep my distance from anyone who might connect Elena Santos to Elena Castellanos. Come home with me, Lucas said, reading my thoughts. You and Marco. You'll be safe in my penthouse until we can figure out who's behind this and eliminate the threat. I can't do that. I can't bring him into your world. Elena, my world is already his world. The moment he was conceived, he became part of this whether we acknowledged it or not. The question is whether he faces it with protection or without it. Marco tugged on my jacket, tired of being ignored while adults had serious conversations he couldn't understand. Mama, up, he demanded, raising his arms in the universal toddler gesture for being picked up. I lifted him into my arms, feeling the solid weight of his small body against my chest. He was everything good and innocent and pure in my life, and the thought of bringing him anywhere near the violence that surrounded Luca made my skin crawl. But the alternative was running again, hiding again, hoping that people who'd already found us once wouldn't find us again. And this time, they weren't interested in polite questions or subtle threats. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. 3 more cars just arrived. Police too, but they're talking to the men, not arresting them. Be careful, Mija. They have official protection, Luca observed, reading over my shoulder. This isn't some rogue operation. This is coordinated, planned, and backed by people with real power. I looked down at Marco, who was now playing with my necklace and humming softly to himself. He trusted me completely to keep him safe, to make the right choices, to protect him from dangers he couldn't even imagine. If I go with you, I said slowly, it's temporary. Until we can identify the real threat and eliminate it. Agreed. And Marco's safety comes first. Before your business, before your reputation, before anything else. Elena, Lucas said, and his voice carried a conviction that made me believe him completely. He's my son. His safety will always come first. Papa, Marco said suddenly, pointing at Luca with delight, as if he'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. Papa, Papa, Papa. The joy in his voice was infectious, and despite everything, despite all my fears and all my careful plans, I found myself smiling. My son had just met his father, and in his uncomplicated 2-year-old worldview, this was cause for celebration. Luca's face transformed as Marco reached for him, and without hesitation, he took his son into his arms for the first time. The sight of them together, so obviously father and child, made my heart ache with 3 years of missed moments and stolen time. Hello, Marco, Lucas said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I'm very happy to meet you. Papa play? Marco asked hopefully, patting Luca's cheek with one small hand. Yes, Luca promised, looking at me over our son's head. Papa will play. Papa will protect. Papa will make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. And despite every logical objection, every reasonable fear, every sensible concern about bringing my child into a world of violence and danger, I found myself nodding. Because sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only choice. Because sometimes love and protection came wrapped in darkness. And because Marco was already clapping his hands and calling Luca Papa with such pure happiness that turning back seemed impossible. 20 minutes later, we were in Luca's armored Mercedes, heading toward his penthouse while my apartment building crawled with men who wanted to hurt my son. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't running alone. For the first time since leaving, I wasn't sure if that was salvation or damnation. Luca's penthouse hadn't changed much in 3 years. The same floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. The same expensive, minimalist furniture spoke of wealth and refined taste, and the same sense of controlled luxury permeated every carefully designed space. What was different was seeing it through Marco's eyes. My son stood in the center of the living room, tiny amid the vast space, his head tilted back as he tried to see the top of the cathedral ceiling. Everything was huge from his perspective, a palace built for giants rather than a home designed for families. Big house, Papa, he said matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. The word Papa still hit Luca like a physical blow every time Marco said it. I watched him struggle to find appropriate responses. This man who commanded respect from dangerous criminals but had no idea how to talk to a 2-year-old. Yes, Luca said carefully. It's a big house. Would you like to see your room? My room. Marco's eyes went wide with excitement. I have room here. The careful hope in his voice broke something in my chest. Marco had always been adaptable, accepting of change in the way that children who'd moved frequently learned to be. But the idea of having his own space, his own territory in this magnificent place, clearly thrilled him. Of course you have a room, Lucas said, and the paternal pride in his voice was unmistakable. You're my son. This is your home now. The possessiveness in that statement should have worried me. Instead, it sent warmth spiraling through my chest that I had no right to feel. This was temporary, I reminded myself. A safe haven until we could eliminate the threat and return to our normal life. Except our normal life had never included Marco having a father who looked at him like he'd hung the moon. Luca led us down a hallway I'd walked countless times before, past the master bedroom, where I'd spent 8 months learning every inch of his body, past the office where he conducted business I pretended not to understand, to a room that had been a guest suite during my time here. It was completely transformed. The neutral adult furniture had been replaced with child-sized pieces in bright primary colors. A toddler bed shaped like a race car sat against one wall, complete with racing stripe sheets. Toy boxes overflowed with age-appropriate games and books. A small table and chair set was positioned near the window, perfect for coloring or puzzle building. "When did you do this?" I asked, unable to hide my amazement. "This morning, while we were talking at the park," Luca replied. "I called Isabella and gave her 2 hours to make this room suitable for my son." Isabella, Luca's mother, the elegant matriarch who'd always treated me with careful politeness during my previous time here. She'd never been unkind, but I'd sensed her disapproval of her son's relationship with someone she considered unsuitable for the family heir. Marco was already exploring, pulling toys from boxes with the focused determination of a child claiming new territory. A train set, building blocks, picture books, art supplies. Everything a 2-year-old could want, purchased and arranged with the efficiency that unlimited money could provide. "It's too much," I said automatically. "It's not enough," Luca countered. "I've missed 2 years of birthdays, 2 Christmases, his first steps, his first words. A room full of toys doesn't compensate for that." The guilt in his voice made my chest ache. He was right, and we both knew it. Marco would never remember not having a father, but Luca would carry the knowledge of missing those early milestones forever. "Mama, look." Marco had discovered a stuffed elephant that was nearly as big as he was. He dragged it across the room with considerable effort, beaming with accomplishment when he managed to climb onto the toddler bed with his new prize. "That's wonderful, baby," I said, settling onto the small chair to watch him play. The domesticity of the moment was dangerous. Too comfortable, too right, too much like the family I dreamed about during those 8 months when I believed Luca and I had a future together. Watching him interact with our son, seeing the careful gentleness he brought to every gesture and word, it was too easy to forget why I'd left in the first place. "Elena," an elegant voice spoke from the doorway, cultured and warm with genuine pleasure. "My dear, you look wonderful." Isabella Torino stood framed in the entrance, impeccably dressed as always, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon. At 68, she remained a beautiful woman with the kind of bone-deep elegance that money couldn't buy. But it was her expression that caught me off guard. No disapproval, no carefully hidden resentment. Instead, her dark eyes sparkled with something that looked remarkably like delight. "Mrs. Torino," I said, rising from the small chair. "It's good to see you again. Isabella, please. We're family now." She moved into the room with the grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "And this must be my grandson." Marco looked up from his elephant, studying this new person with the serious consideration he gave all strangers. Isabella approached slowly, wisely giving him time to assess her. "Hello, Marco," she said, crouching down with surprising agility for her age. "I'm your nana. Do you know what that means?" Marco shook his head, curious but not afraid. "It means I'm your papa's mama, and I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." The simple explanation worked perfectly. Marco's face lit up with understanding, and he immediately abandoned his elephant to approach this fascinating new relative. "Nana," he repeated carefully, testing the unfamiliar word. "Nana here too?" "I'm here too," Isabella confirmed. "And I brought something for you." She produced a small wrapped package from her purse, and Marco's excitement was immediate and infectious. He accepted the gift with the barely contained energy of a child who understood that packages contained wonderful surprises. Inside was a photo album, clearly handmade with love and care. The first page showed a baby picture of Luca, his dark hair and serious expression unmistakably familiar. "That's your papa when he was little," Isabella explained. "Just like you." Marco studied the picture with intense concentration, then looked between Luca and the photograph. "Papa baby," he announced with satisfaction. The joy on Isabella's face was radiant. She'd been waiting 3 years to be a grandmother, I realized. Waiting for Luca to find someone he could build a family with. Waiting for the next generation to carry on traditions and memories. "He's perfect," she said, looking at me with tears in her eyes. "Elena, he's absolutely perfect." The warmth in her voice nearly undid me. I'd expected judgment, disapproval, maybe even hostility for keeping Marco hidden. Instead, she was treating me like a beloved daughter-in-law who'd finally brought her grandchild home. While Marco and Isabella looked through the photo album together, Luca moved to stand beside me near the window. He was close enough that I could smell his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from his body, sense the controlled power that had always been part of his appeal. "She loves him already," he said quietly. "Of course she does. He's your son. And yours," he pointed out. "That matters to her more than you might think." I turned to look at him, confused by the implication in his words. "My mother blamed herself for what happened between us," Luca explained. "She thought her disapproval drove you away. She spent 3 years regretting that she didn't make more effort to welcome you into the family. Mrs. Torino never disapproved of me personally. She disapproved of the situation. An unknown woman with unclear intentions moving into her son's life. She was protecting me, the same way you've been protecting Marco. Mothers do that, even when their children are grown men who should be capable of protecting themselves." The parallel he was drawing between my protective instincts and his mother's made uncomfortable sense. How many decisions had I made based on fear rather than facts? How many assumptions had I built into unshakable beliefs? My laptop chimed with an incoming email, and I moved to check it. The message was from a contact at the Tribune, someone who'd helped me research the Tony Martinez case during the months before I'd disappeared. "Elena," the message read, "I found something about that audio file you asked me to verify. The voice analysis came back inconclusive for Luca Torino, but there's something else. The background audio contains sounds that match recordings from the Castellano family compound in Cicero. Timestamps suggest the recording was made there, not at any Torino property." My hands shook as I read the technical analysis attached to the email. Every piece of evidence I'd used to justify my hatred of Luca, every reason I'd given myself for staying away, was crumbling under scrutiny. "What is it?" Luca asked, moving to read over my shoulder. "Proof that you were right. The recording that convinced me you killed Tony was made at a Castellano property. They used voice modification software to make it sound like you giving the order." The rage that crossed his face was cold and controlled, more dangerous than any explosive anger could have been. "They killed your friend and made sure you blamed me for it. They wanted you gone, out of Chicago, away from any investigation that might expose their operations. But why? Why would the Castellanos want Tony dead? Because Tony wasn't just informing on my family, Elena. He was informing on everyone, including them. And they had more to lose from exposure than we did." Marco's laughter from across the room provided a jarring contrast to our grim conversation. He'd discovered that Isabella had brought coloring books in addition to the photo album, and they were now engaged in creating what appeared to be a masterpiece involving purple horses and green trees. "They have to know I'm here now," I said. "They have to know I've figured out the truth." "Which means they'll escalate," Luca agreed. "They can't afford to have you alive with evidence that could expose them for Tony's murder." As if summoned by his words, Vincent appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Boss, we have a problem. Castellano soldiers are positioning around the building. Sniper on the roof across the street, cars blocking the exits. They're not planning to negotiate." "How many?" Luca asked, immediately shifting into the mode I remembered from his business dealings. Calm, focused, calculating odds and options with professional detachment. 12 that we can count. Probably more we can't. They're serious about this, boss. This isn't intimidation. This is elimination." Isabella looked up from her coloring session with Marco, her face pale but determined. "Marco, darling, why don't we go to the kitchen and make cookies?" she suggested with the kind of forced cheerfulness adults used when protecting children from adult fears. "Cook cookies." Marco agreed enthusiastically, abandoning his crayons for this new adventure. I watched them leave, my heart hammering with terror I couldn't let my son see. He was 2 years old. He was innocent. He didn't deserve to be caught in a war that had started before he was born. "Get them to the safe room," Luca instructed Vincent. "Full lockdown protocol. And call Roberto. I want every available man here in 10 minutes. "What about Elena?" Vincent asked. "Elena stays with me," Lucas said, and his voice brooked no argument. "No," I protested. "I should be with Marco. If something happens, he'll need his mother. If something happens, he'll need both his parents alive to protect him. Elena," You have the evidence that can end this. You're the primary target. Keeping you safe keeps him safe. The sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the penthouse ended our debate. They weren't waiting for negotiations or ultimatums. They were coming. Luca pulled a gun from a hidden panel behind a painting, checking the clip with practiced efficiency. The transformation from gentle father to lethal predator was instantaneous and terrifying. Stay low, stay behind me, and don't hesitate if I tell you to run, he instructed, moving toward the living room with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. The next few minutes blurred together in chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the sound of expensive furniture being destroyed by bullets and blood. I'd never been in a firefight before, never experienced the surreal combination of terror and hyper-awareness that came with mortal danger. But I watched Luca move through it like it was choreography he'd performed countless times. Efficient, deadly, protecting his family with the same focused intensity he'd once brought to protecting me. When the shooting stopped, for Castellano soldiers were dead and the rest had retreated. Luca was bleeding from a graze on his arm, but his eyes were blazing with satisfied fury. It's over, he said, checking his weapon before moving to secure the area. They made their play and lost. No, I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. It's just beginning. This was a probe, not the real attack. They wanted to test your defenses, see how you'd respond. He looked at me with new respect. You're right. This was reconnaissance, which means Marco isn't safe here. Nowhere is safe as long as the Castellanos see him as leverage against you. Elena, Lucas said, his voice gentle despite the violence we'd just witnessed. I know this isn't the life you wanted for him, but it's the life he was born into, and running won't change that. The only way to keep him safe is to eliminate the threat completely. I moved to the window, looking down at the street where emergency vehicles were arriving. Somewhere in this building, my son was probably asking Isabella why there had been loud noises, trusting that the adults would keep him safe. I'd spent 3 years believing that keeping Marco away from his father would protect him from violence. Instead, I'd just delayed the inevitable confrontation while making us more vulnerable. What do you need from me? I asked, turning back to face the man I'd loved and lost and found again. I need you to trust me, he said. I need you to let me protect you both the way I should have been doing all along. And despite every logical objection, despite every reasonable fear about what trusting Luca Torino meant for our future, I found myself nodding. Because our son was worth any risk. Because some wars could only be won by fighting them. And because the man standing before me, blood on his shirt and determination in his eyes, was still the only person I'd ever loved enough to trust with everything that mattered. The call came at 3 a.m, 3 days after the attack on the penthouse. I'd been lying awake in the guest room, listening to the sound of Luca's security team making their rounds and trying to process everything that had changed in less than a week. Marco slept peacefully in his race car bed, exhausted from a day of being spoiled by his grandmother and learning that having a father meant unlimited piggyback rides and someone strong enough to swing him high into the air. Luca's voice carried down the hallway, low and controlled, but edged with something that made my blood run cold. When he appeared in my doorway moments later, his face was carved from stone. They have my mother, he said without preamble. The words hit me like physical blows. Isabella, who'd spent the afternoon teaching Marco Italian words for colors while they painted together. Isabella, who'd looked at me with such warmth and acceptance that I'd almost forgotten why I'd stayed away for 3 years. How? I asked, sitting up in bed and pulling on the robe I'd taken to sleeping in since moving back into Luca's world. She went to morning mass at St. Mary's. Same church, same time, every Tuesday for 30 years. My security team was with her, but the Castellanos were willing to sacrifice 6 men to get to her. 6 men. Dead because someone wanted to use a grandmother as leverage against her son. The casualness of such violence should have horrified me. Instead, I felt rage burning in my chest, clean and pure and focused. What do they want? Me, obviously. And you. They want the evidence that proves they killed Tony, and they want to eliminate everyone who knows the truth about their operations. His voice was calm, professional, but I could see the fury in his eyes. Luca loved his mother with the devoted intensity that Italian sons were famous for. Taking Isabella wasn't just tactical, it was personal. What's the trade? Noon today. Millennium Park, near where we talked yesterday. They want both of us, unarmed, in exchange for her safe return. It's a trap, I said unnecessarily. Of course it's a trap. They have no intention of letting any of us leave that park alive. He moved to the window, looking down at the street below where his men maintained their vigilant watch. Even in the early morning light, his posture radiated controlled violence and careful planning. So what's the real plan? I asked, knowing that Luca hadn't built his empire by walking into obvious traps. Roberto is positioning snipers on surrounding buildings. Vincent is coordinating ground teams. We'll have overwhelming force in place before the exchange. And what about me? Where do I fit into this military operation? You don't, Lucas said, turning back to face me. You stay here with Marco where you're safe. The dismissal in his voice sparked anger that surprised me with its intensity. No, I said, standing to face him. Absolutely not. Elena, this isn't a discussion. You're not trained for this kind of operation, and I won't risk losing you and my son in the same day. I'm not staying behind while your mother dies because of evidence I gathered. I'm not hiding in this penthouse while you face the people who killed my friend. You're not thinking clearly. You're a journalist, not a soldier. You have no experience with violence, no training with weapons, no understanding of how these situations unfold. His words stung because they contained enough truth to wound. I wasn't trained for warfare. I didn't understand tactical operations or combat strategy. But I understood something else, something Luca was too focused on protecting me to recognize. You're right, I said, moving closer until we were standing face to face. I'm not a soldier, but I am an investigative journalist, and I know how to find people who don't want to be found. How do you think I tracked down your money laundering operations? How do you think I got close enough to your organization to gather evidence? I could see him reassessing, the predatory intelligence that made him dangerous beginning to focus on what I was offering rather than what I lacked. You want to find where they're really holding Isabella, I continued. You want to know their backup plan, their escape routes, their real intentions. I can do that. I can find information that your soldiers can't access. What kind of information? Give me 2 hours on my laptop, access to the Tribune's research databases, and contact with sources in the FBI's organized crime unit. I'll find out where they're keeping her, how many men they have, and what their real plan is for today. And then we work together. As partners, not as protector and protected. You handle the tactical elements, and I handle the intelligence gathering. He studied my face for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing my value as an asset against his desire to keep me safe. If I agree to this, he said finally, you follow my lead completely once we're operational. No heroics. No independent action. No putting yourself at unnecessary risk. Agreed, I said, already moving toward my laptop. The next 2 hours were a blur of phone calls, database searches, and the kind of investigative work that had made my reputation before Luca Torino had complicated everything. I contacted sources in federal law enforcement, cross-referenced property records for Castellano Holdings, and analyzed communication patterns that revealed more than anyone realized about their operational methods. What I found changed everything. They're not holding Isabella at any of their known properties. I told Luca as his team gathered in the living room for final briefings. She's being kept at a warehouse in Cicero that's officially owned by a shell company, but the utilities are paid by an account that traces back to Judge Marcus Benedetti. Sophia's father? Luca's expression darkened. He's working with the Castellanos? It gets worse. The phone records show 17 calls between Benedetti and Rico Castellano in the past month. All after your engagement to Sophia was announced. The implications were staggering. Judge Benedetti had arranged his daughter's marriage to Luca while secretly working with the Castellanos. The wedding I'd crashed hadn't just been a business alliance. It had been an elaborate setup designed to position the Castellanos to destroy the Torino family from within. Vincent, coordinate with Roberto on new positioning, Luca ordered. We're not going to the park. We're going to Cicero, and we're ending this today. Boss, Vincent said carefully, the warehouse is heavily fortified. Industrial district, multiple escape routes, easy to defend. They chose the location for tactical advantage. Then we make our own advantages, Luca replied. Elena, how many entrances does the building have? I pulled up the architectural plans I'd accessed through the city planning office. For main entrances, plus emergency exits here and here, I said, pointing to the blueprints. But there's also a maintenance tunnel that connects to the storm drain system. They probably don't know about it because it's not on the original plans. It was added during renovation 2 years ago. Can you access it? I've navigated worse. Remember, I spent months researching your organization. I know how to move through places where I'm not supposed to be. The operation launched an hour later. I'd never been part of anything like it. The carefully choreographed violence that professional criminals brought to serious conflicts. Luca's men moved with efficiency that spoke of extensive training and bitter experience. My role was supposed to be simple: guide them through the maintenance tunnel, help them locate Isabella, then stay out of the way while they eliminated the threat. Of course, nothing ever went according to plan. We found Isabella in a storage room on the second floor, tied to a chair but unharmed. Her eyes lit up when she saw us, relief and gratitude replacing fear as Luca cut her bonds with swift, gentle movements. "Marco," she whispered. "Safe," I assured her. "He's at the penthouse with Mrs. Rodriguez, probably building elaborate block castles and eating too many cookies." The reunion was brief. Vincent's voice crackled through Luca's earpiece with urgent warnings about Castellano reinforcements approaching the building. "We need to move now," Luca said, helping his mother to her feet. That's when Rico Castellano stepped out of the shadows, gun trained on Isabella's chest. "I don't think so," he said, and his voice carried the calm confidence of someone who'd planned this moment carefully. "You're all going to walk out of here very slowly, hands visible, and then we're going to have a conversation about evidence and cooperation and what happens to families who interfere with Castellano business." He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of expensive grooming that spoke of money and vanity in equal measure. More importantly, he was focused entirely on Luca and Isabella, confident that I posed no threat. He was wrong. The gun Vincent had insisted I carry felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I pulled it from the holster concealed under my jacket. I'd never shot anyone before, had barely touched a weapon outside of the training session Luca's men had given me earlier. But Rico Castellano was pointing a gun at the woman who'd spent the afternoon teaching my son Italian words for family. "Put it down," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. Rico laughed, a sound full of genuine amusement. "The journalist wants to play soldier," he said mockingly. "Elena, you're a writer, not a killer. You don't have it in you." "You killed Tony Martinez," I said, keeping the gun aimed at his chest. "You murdered my friend and tried to frame Luca for it. You've terrorized my son and kidnapped an innocent woman." "Tony was weak," Rico replied dismissively. "He would have destroyed everything we'd built. As for your son, he's Torino blood. That makes him a legitimate target." The casual dismissal of Marco's innocence, the cold calculation that would justify hurting a 2-year-old, crystallized something inside me. Some lines couldn't be crossed. Some threats couldn't be tolerated. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Rico looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt with genuine surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. "You shot me," he said accusingly, and then collapsed. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds before the building erupted in chaos. Shouting, running footsteps, returned gunfire from Rico's men. But Luca's team was ready, and the Castellanos had lost their leader. It was over in minutes. "Elena," Luca said, checking my face for signs of shock or trauma. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, and realized I meant it. I'd taken a life, crossed a line I'd never imagined crossing, and I felt nothing but grim satisfaction. We retrieved the evidence from Rico's office, files that documented not just Tony's murder, but years of corruption involving Judge Benedetti and half a dozen other officials. Enough to destroy the Castellano organization completely and expose their network of bought influence. Outside the warehouse, as federal agents arrested the surviving Castellanos and paramedics checked Isabella for injuries, Luca pulled me aside. "What you did in there," he said quietly. "Shooting Rico, saving my mother, working as a partner instead of someone who needed protection. That took courage I wasn't sure you had." "I've always had courage, Luca. I just hadn't been pushed far enough to show it." He reached up to cup my face in his hands, his green-gray eyes intense with emotion I recognized, but hadn't seen in 3 years. "I love you, Elena. Not the woman you pretended to be, not the journalist who infiltrated my organization, not the mother of my son. I love you. The real you, the complete you, The woman who shoots killers to protect my family. I love you too, I whispered, and the admission felt like coming home after years of wandering in the dark. When he kissed me, it tasted like gunpowder and promises in the future we'd almost thrown away. It tasted like trust rebuilt and fears overcome, and two people who'd finally stopped running from what they'd always known was true. We had a son to raise, a life to build, and a love that had survived deception and violence and 3 years of separation. We had everything that mattered. And for the first time since I'd crashed his wedding and declared war on his world, I believed we might actually get to keep it. 1 week after the warehouse, life had settled into something that resembled normalcy if you ignored the federal agents still processing evidence and the reporters camping outside the building asking questions about the Castellano investigation. Marco had adapted to his new reality with the resilience that children possessed, treating his father's constant presence like an extended playdate that never had to end. I found them in the living room that morning, both lying on the floor building what appeared to be the most elaborate block city in architectural history. Marco was providing detailed explanations about which buildings were for dinosaurs and which were for spaceships, while Luca listened with the serious attention he'd once reserved for business strategy meetings. "This tower is for flying cars, Papa," Marco announced, carefully balancing another block on his precarious construction. "Flying cars are very important," Luca agreed solemnly. "Where will people park them?" "In the clouds." Marco's logic was unassailable in the way that only 2-year-old reasoning could be. Watching them together, seeing the easy affection that had developed between father and son, something settled in my chest that had been restless for 3 years. Marco would grow up knowing his father's strength, his protection, his unconditional love. He'd also grow up understanding that strength sometimes required difficult choices, that protection came with responsibilities, and that love meant standing together against whatever threatened the people you cared about. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for him when I'd fled Chicago. It was better. "Elena," Lucas said, looking up from the block city. "Do you have a few minutes? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." The formality in his voice made me curious, but Marco's presence meant whatever conversation we were about to have would be conducted in the careful language adults used when small ears were listening. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Actually, Marco, I think your mama and I need to ask you something very important." Marco abandoned his blocks immediately, drawn by the promise of being included in adult business. He climbed onto the couch between us, his small face serious with the weight of his new responsibilities. "You know how much I love your mama, right?" Luca asked, and his voice carried a gentleness I'd rarely heard during our previous time together. Marco nodded emphatically. "Mama pretty. Papa love mama. And I love you very much too. You're my son, and you're the most important person in my world." "I love Papa too," Marco declared, then looked between us expectantly. "What question?" Luca reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made my breath catch in my throat. He'd proposed before, 3 years ago, with a ring that had probably cost more than most people's cars. But that proposal had come at the end of a perfect dinner, surrounded by candles and romantic music and all the trappings of a fairy tale I believed was real. This proposal was happening on the living room floor, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, with our son watching and last night's takeout containers still on the coffee table. It was ordinary and domestic and absolutely perfect. "Marco," Lucas said seriously, "I'd like to ask your mama to marry me. That would make us a real family, officially and forever. Is that something you'd like?" "Marry." Marco clapped his hands with delight, though I suspected he had only the vaguest understanding of what marriage actually meant. "Mama marry Papa. Big party." Lucas' smile was radiant as he turned to face me. The ring box opened to reveal a simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond. Nothing ostentatious or overwhelming, just elegant and timeless and exactly right. "Elena Santos," he said, and using my chosen name instead of my birth name felt like acceptance of everything I'd become during our years apart. "I love you completely, unconditionally, and eternally. I love your courage, your strength, your dedication to protecting the people you care about. I love that you're an incredible mother and an amazing partner and brave enough to shoot killers when necessary." I laughed despite the tears building in my eyes. Only Luca would include marksmanship in a marriage proposal. "I can't promise you a life without danger," because that's not the world we live in. But I can promise that we'll face whatever comes together, as partners, as equals, as a family that nothing can break. He slid off the couch to kneel on the floor beside Marco, the ring extended toward me with hands that were completely steady. Will you marry me? Yes, I whispered, then louder, with certainty that rang through every part of my being. Yes, absolutely, completely yes. Marco erupted in excited cheers as Luca slipped the ring onto my finger, and I realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the desperate intensity of our earlier relationship, built on secrets and passion and the constant knowledge that it could all disappear. This was deeper, steadier, founded on truth and trust, and the absolute certainty that we could weather any storm as long as we faced it together. When he kissed me, Marco immediately climbed into our laps, determined not to be left out of any family celebration. We ended up in a laughing pile on the floor, surrounded by toy blocks and the promise of forever. The next few weeks passed in a blur of wedding planning that bore no resemblance to Luca's previous engagement to Sophia. Instead of elaborate formality designed to impress Chicago society, we planned something intimate and meaningful. Isabella took charge with the enthusiastic efficiency of a woman who'd waited 3 years to plan her son's wedding to someone she actually approved of. "She's perfect for you," she told Luca one afternoon while we sampled flowers and argued about invitation wording. "Elena understands that loving you means accepting everything you are, not trying to change you into something safer." The comment was clearly meant for me to overhear, a gentle acknowledgement of how much my perspective had changed. I wasn't trying to reform Luca or convince him to abandon the family business. I was choosing to love him as he was, dangerous edges and all, while finding my own place in his world. That place, it turned out, was more interesting than I'd expected. "I've been thinking about your skills," Luca said one evening as we put Marco to bed together. "The investigative abilities, the research techniques, the talent for finding information that people want to keep hidden. I'm not going back to journalism, if that's what you're suggesting. At least not the traditional kind. Not traditional journalism, no. But the family has legitimate businesses that could benefit from someone who knows how to investigate corruption and expose criminal activity. You want me to become a corporate investigator? I want you to use your talents to protect the things we care about. There are people trying to damage our legitimate operations, competitors who think they can use underhanded tactics because we won't fight back through legal channels." The idea intrigued me more than I wanted to admit. Using my skills to protect rather than expose, investigating threats to defend my family rather than pursuing stories that might destroy other families. "I could do that," I said slowly. "I could be very good at that. I know you could. And Elena, it would keep you involved in meaningful work while keeping you safe. No more infiltrating dangerous organizations or putting yourself at risk for stories." Is that an order or a request? It's the plea of a man who loves you too much to lose you again. 6 months later, I stood in the bathroom of our penthouse, staring at a positive pregnancy test and marveling at how completely my life had transformed. Elena Torino, married mother of one with another baby on the way, successful investigative consultant for Torino Industries, and absolutely, completely happy. The morning sickness had been subtle, just enough to make me wonder before the missed period confirmed what I'd suspected. This pregnancy felt different from my time carrying Marco, marked by security and support instead of fear and uncertainty. Luca found me there, reading the test results with a smile that probably looked ridiculous. "Good news?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Very good news. Marco's going to be a big brother." The joy on his face was radiant. He spun me around the bathroom, careful despite his excitement, already protective of the child we'd created together. Have you ever wondered if the most unexpected moments lead to the greatest happiness? Because right now I'm curious what you think about taking chances on love when everything seems stacked against it. Do you believe that sometimes crashing into someone's life, literally disrupting everything they thought they wanted, can lead to exactly what they actually needed? Marco wandered into our bedroom a few minutes later, drawn by the sound of laughter and excited voices. At 2.5, he'd grown into his role as the center of our universe with the confidence that comes from being absolutely, unconditionally adored. "Daddy," he said, the word still new enough to make Luca's face light up every time he heard it. "Daddy, why you and Mama dancing?" "We're celebrating, buddy." Your mama just told me some very good news. What news? In about 7 months, you're going to have a baby brother or sister. Someone new to play with and teach about spaceships and flying cars. Marco's eyes went wide with excitement. Baby. I teach baby about dinosaurs. You're going to be the best big brother in the world, I assured him, pulling him up for a family hug that encompassed everything important in my life. Later that evening, after Marco had fallen asleep and Isabella had returned to her own apartment across town, Luca and I sat on our balcony watching the city lights reflect off Lake Michigan. My hand rested on my still flat stomach while his arm held me against his side. Do you ever think about that day in the cathedral? I asked. About how differently things could have gone if I'd lost my nerve, or if you'd had me arrested instead of listening. Every day, he replied. I think about how close we came to missing this completely. How your courage changed everything. My courage or my desperation? Both. Sometimes they're the same thing. I thought about Tony Martinez, whose death had driven me to seek justice and accidentally led me back to the love I'd thought was lost forever. I thought about Marco, sleeping safely in his race car bed, completely unaware that his existence had been the key to healing his parents' broken hearts. I thought about Isabella, who'd welcomed me into her family with open arms despite every reason to hold grudges. Mostly, I thought about the moment I'd stood up in that cathedral and changed the trajectory of our lives forever. Best decision I ever made, I said quietly. Crashing my wedding? Crashing your wedding. Keeping our son, shooting Rico Castellano. Agreeing to marry you despite everything logic said about the danger. All of it. Luca's laughter was warm against my ear. You realize you've become more dangerous than most of my business associates? Good, I said, meaning it completely. Anyone who threatens our family should be afraid of what I'm willing to do to protect them. 5 years ago, Elena Castellanos had been a naive journalist who believed that love and violence were incompatible, that choosing safety meant avoiding dangerous men. Elena Torino understood that love sometimes required violence, that safety came from standing together against threats, and that the most dangerous thing in the world was someone with everything to lose. Marco's cry from his bedroom interrupted our peaceful moment, the kind of nightmare disruption that was part of parenting young children. But when we reached his room, we found him sitting up in bed, not crying but calling out excitedly. Mama, Daddy, I dreamed about baby. Baby was flying with the dinosaurs. Of course she was, sweetheart, Lucas said, settling onto the toddler bed to comfort our son. Flying dinosaurs are the best kind. As I watched my husband soothe our son while our second child grew inside me, I reflected on the strange path that had brought us to this moment. I'd set out to destroy Luca Torino and ended up building a life with him. I'd crashed his wedding to expose his crimes and ended up wearing his ring. I tried to keep Marco safe from his father's world and ended up making that world safer for our son. Sometimes the best outcomes came from the worst plans. Sometimes love required you to risk everything you thought you wanted for everything you actually needed. And sometimes crashing a wedding was exactly the right thing to do, even when everyone in the cathedral thought you'd lost your mind. Especially then.